The invitation to Nana Helen's 80th birthday felt less like a request and more like a summons. I knew from the moment it landed in my inbox. It had been 2 years since I'd willingly walked into a room with my entire extended family. Especially with Morgan, my older sister, present. The air in that rented hall tonight was already thick with unspoken resentments, a familiar perfume of passive aggression that clung to the polyester tablecloths. Or maybe that was just my own anxiety clouding the imported lace. They said it was a celebration, a milestone for a woman I genuinely adored. But my stomach churned with a different kind of anticipation. It's a funny thing. Family, they're the people who are supposed to build you up. But mine often felt like a demolition crew, specializing in me. I spotted Morgan across the room, holding court near the wilting appetizer display. Her laughter, a little too loud. Her designer dress a size too smug. She caught my eye and offered a saccharine smile, the kind that barely concealed the glint of a freshly sharpened blade. Tonight, she wouldn't just call me a failure, a title she'd generously bestowed upon me for years. She had a whole presentation planned, apparently, complete with a private investigator's report she thought would be my undoing. Little did she know, that investigator, a quiet man named Mr. Davies, had unearthed something far more scandalous. The truth he found wasn't about my supposed shortcomings, but about the meticulously crafted lies propping up Morgan's perfect life. And that meticulously documented truth was about to turn Nana Helen's 80th birthday from a polite family gathering into a stage for a reckoning no one, least of all Morgan, would ever forget. My smile, the one I practiced. It wasn't just a shield tonight, it was the curtain before the storm. My online shop, Desert Bloom Pottery, isn't exactly a Fortune 500 company. But it's mine, built with my own 2 hands, sweat, and a kill I bought secondhand after saving for what felt like a lifetime. I sculpt, I glaze, I ship out pieces of myself to strangers who somehow find beauty in my imperfect creations. It's a quiet life, a stark contrast to the constant opera of drama that was my upbringing in suburban Ohio. For years, Morgan, with her Ivy League aspirations and eventual corporate ascent in Chicago, was the golden child, while I was, well, let's just say artist was often pronounced with a silent starving before it by certain family members. The final straw wasn't one grand explosion, but a series of paper cuts, those tiny, stinging remarks about my unconventional path or my lack of ambition that Morgan specialized in, often delivered with a concerned tilt of her head at family dinners. It was her comment during what was supposed to be a celebratory dinner for my first gallery showing. "It's cute, Ava, that you have a hobby that pays for your, well, some of your paint," that finally made something snap. I didn't scream, didn't cause a scene. I just faded, stopped answering calls that felt like interrogations, declined invitations that were just setups for criticism. That was 2 years ago, a silence Morgan likely interpreted as my ultimate failure, further proof of her superiority. But that silence was my sanctuary, the soil from which Desert Bloom Pottery, finally, truly, began to grow. Coming back for Nana Helen, though, felt non-negotiable. She was the one person who'd ever sent me a small, anonymously mailed check when I first started, with a note that just said, "Keep creating, Wildflower." I often wondered if she knew how much that simple gesture, that quiet belief, had fueled me through the toughest nights. So here I was, back in the lion's den, armed with a polite smile and the knowledge that my definition of success didn't need their validation, even if Morgan was about to try and tear it down with a hired gun. The irony was, her attempt to expose my failure was about to spotlight a different kind of success, the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who'd learned to thrive, not despite her scars, but because of them. And perhaps, just perhaps, Mr. Davies's report would finally show Nana Helen the kind of success Morgan truly embodied. Nana Helen greeted me at the entrance to the Chestnut Room, the private dining area they'd booked. Her hug was frail but genuine, a warm island in the chilly sea of obligatory smiles I was navigating. "Ava, darling, you made it. You look, well, you look like you," she'd said. Her eyes, a little cloudy with age, still held that spark of affection. It was a typical Nana Helen compliment, vague enough not to offend anyone else within earshot, yet personal enough for me to understand. She meant it kindly. But beyond her, the gauntlet of relatives was already assembling. My mother, Martha, offered a tight-lipped smile and a quick "Ava, good to see you," her gaze flicking over my dress. A simple, self-made linen piece, probably cataloging its lack of designer pedigree. Dad just grunted a hello, already halfway into a conversation with Uncle Leo about property taxes, a topic far safer than acknowledging my presence for too long. Then Morgan made her entrance, or rather, her re-entrance, as if sensing my arrival had shifted the room's gravitational pull. Slightly, she glided over, martini in hand. Was it ever not in her hand at these things? Her earlier saccharine smile now upgraded to a look of performative concern. "Ava, you came. We were all so hoping you would," she cooed, her voice dripping, with an insincerity so thick you could spread it on a cracker. The way she emphasized hoping felt like a verbal jab, a reminder of my previous absences. My supposed transgressions against the sacred family unit. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Morgan," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. My own smile a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. Her eyes, however, sharp and assessing, lingered on me a moment too long, as if searching for cracks in the facade, for any sign that her impending revelation was already causing me distress. Little did she know, the only distress I felt was the boredom of her predictability, and a faint, thrilling anticipation for the show that was about to unfold, a show where she was the unwitting star. Her surprise, for me, the one she thought would be my public crucifixion, was about to become her own undoing, and honestly, I was starting to look forward to the fireworks. Dinner was served, a roasted chicken that was surprisingly moist, considering the usual catering standards for such events. But the food was just a backdrop to the real meal being served. My slow roasted discomfort, courtesy of Morgan. She sat directly across from me, a strategic placement I was sure she'd orchestrated. Every story she told, every anecdote she shared, seemed to have a subtle, almost imperceptible barb aimed in my direction. When someone mentioned the booming tech industry in Austin, where I now lived and quietly ran desert bloom pottery from my small studio, Morgan chimed in. "Oh, Austin. Yes, such a transient place, isn't it? Lots of people trying to find themselves. So many hobbies." The word hobbies dripped with condescension. I remembered the cryptic email I'd received a week prior, from an address I didn't recognize. "Watch your six at Helen's party. EM's on the warpath." At the time, I'd dismissed it as a prank, or perhaps a misdirected message meant for another unfortunate soul with a sister named Morgan. But now, her pointed remarks felt less like random snipes and more like calculated artillery fire. My mother, bless her conflict-avoidant heart, just kept praising the string beans, while Dad seemed to find the pattern on his plate utterly fascinating. Nana Helen, however, shot Morgan a brief unreadable glance before turning to ask me about my drive up from North Carolina, a gentle attempt to redirect the conversation. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. Morgan, however, was relentless. "So Ava," she began, her voice smooth as silk, her eyes gleaming, still playing with clay. "Or have you found something, shall we say, more substantial, to occupy your time lately?" The table fell into an awkward silence, the clinking of cutlery a sudden, deafening roar. This was it, the overture to her grand performance. I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and for some, a thinly veiled anticipation of drama. I took a slow sip of water, my hand surprisingly steady. The calm I projected was a carefully constructed dam against the tide of old insecurities her words threatened to unleash. But beneath it, a different kind of current was stirring, not fear, but a strange, almost exhilarating resolve. She had no idea what was coming. The dessert course arrived, a lemon raspberry cake, Nana Helen's favorite. Its cheerful yellow frosting a stark, almost mocking contrast to the tension coiling in the room. Morgan, however, waved away her slice, a theatrical gesture of someone with more pressing matters on their mind. "Before we all get to lost in sugar comas," she announced, her voice resonating with a feigned brightness that set my teeth on edge. "I actually have a little something I'd like to share. Something I think is important for everyone here, as family, to be aware of." My fork paused midway to my mouth. The cake suddenly looked like a prop in a badly staged play. Uncle Leo leaned forward, his earlier disinterest replaced by a sudden, almost vulture-like attentiveness. This was Morgan's stage, and she was reveling in her role as the harbinger of uncomfortable truths. "You see," she continued, slowly, pulling a crisp manila folder from her ridiculously overpriced handbag, "our dear Ava here has been on quite an adventure these past couple of years." Her gaze swept across the table, landing on me with a pitying expression that was pure performance. And while we all wish her well, of course, I felt it was my duty, as her older sister, to ensure everything was well above board. The words duty and above board hung in the air, heavy with insinuation, reeking of self-righteousness. She tapped the manila folder with a perfectly manicured fingernail. So, I took the liberty of doing a little fact-checking. The room was silent save for the distant hum of the restaurant's main dining area. Even Dad had stopped pretending to be absorbed by his empty dessert plate, his eyes now fixed on Morgan with a mixture of apprehension and, dare I say, a flicker of something that looked like fear. This wasn't just about my pottery anymore, was it? This was about Morgan needing to reassert her dominance. To ensure her narrative of being the successful, responsible one remained unchallenged. The folder lay on the table between us, a silent, beige bomb, ticking. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was inside, Morgan believed it was enough to shatter not just my evening, but the carefully rebuilt sense of self I'd fought so hard for. But a tiny, defiant voice whispered from a place deep inside me, "Let her try." Morgan let the silence hang for a moment longer, a conductor relishing the hush before a dramatic crescendo. Then, with the flourish of a stage magician producing a rabbit from a hat, she reached into that ridiculously oversized designer tote bag she always carried, the kind that probably cost more than my first kill, and retrieved the manila folder. It wasn't just any folder. It looked thick, official, almost weaponized in her grip. She placed it on the table with a soft thud that nonetheless echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly cavernous room. "Now, I know some of you," she began, her voice adopting a tone of faux sympathy, "might think this is a bit much." Her eyes flicked towards Nana, Helen, then to our parents. A calculated appeal for understanding, or perhaps a preemptive strike against any dissent. But as I said, I felt a certain responsibility. Ava is my sister, after all. That word again, sister, wielded like a shield for her less than sisterly actions. My heart was a trapped bird against my ribs, but I forced my expression to remain one of mild, almost bored curiosity. I had to. Giving her the satisfaction of my distress was not on the evening's agenda. I remembered that cryptic email again, EMS on the warpath, and a cold understanding settled in. This was the warpath, and that folder was her chosen weapon. So, Morgan continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried to every corner of our table, I engaged the services of a professional. A Mr. Davies from a reputable firm in Chicago. Just to get a clearer picture, you understand, of Ava's current endeavors. She made endeavors sound like a polite euphemism for a life of crime or some unspeakable vice. I imagined this, Mr. Davies. Was he some grizzled, trenchcoat-wearing caricature, or a sleek, modern operative? Had Morgan fed him a carefully curated, sob story about her wayward sister, painting herself as the concerned, responsible sibling just trying to help? The thought made my stomach clench. The faces around the table were a gallery of rapt attention, Uncle Leo practically salivating, Mom looking like she might faint, Dad staring intently at the folder as if it contained the secrets of the universe, or at least, the secrets of his disappointing younger daughter. Nana Helen, however, watched Morgan with an unnervingly steady gaze, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by something harder, more discerning. It was in that moment, seeing Nana's quiet scrutiny, that a sliver of my carefully constructed composure almost cracked, not with fear, but with a surge of protective anger on her behalf. This was her 80th birthday, for crying out loud. But I held it together. Theatrics were Morgan's domain. My strength lay in the quiet truth, a truth I suspected Mr. Davies, in his professional capacity, might have stumbled upon more of than Morgan anticipated. After all, true professionals are thorough, aren't they? They follow all leads. Morgan cleared her throat, a small, deliberate sound that seemed to suck all remaining levity from the room. As I was saying, she purred, opening the folder with an almost reverent slowness. Mr. Davies was exceptionally thorough. Her eyes met mine again, a flicker of triumph dancing in their depths. He looked into desert bloom pottery. Of course. She paused, letting the name of my small business hang in the air like an accusation. And he found, well, let's just say, the bloom might be a bit exaggerated. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath from certain corners of the table. The unspoken I knew it's forming on their lips. My own breath hitched, not because I feared what she'd say about my business, I knew its modest truth, but because of the sheer audacity, the venomous glee with which she was preparing to dissect my life. How had she spun this to Mr. Davies? Had she painted me as some delusional wannabe, squandering a non-existent inheritance on a pipe dream? Or worse, had she implied some sort of shady dealings, some desperate measures to keep my hobby Afloat. The email I'd received EMs on the warpath suddenly felt less like a warning and more like an understatement. It wasn't just a warpath. It was a meticulously planned siege, and this folder was her battering ram. I remembered a conversation with a former colleague of Morgan's from years ago, someone who'd left the Chicago firm after a particularly nasty office politics incident. She'd described Morgan as someone who could sell ice to an Eskimo, and then convince them they desperately needed the extended warranty. That manipulative charisma, I realized with a sickening lurch, was probably what she'd unleashed on Mr. Davies. Perhaps she'd even subtly hinted at her own concerns about my financial stability, prompting him to dig in areas she knew, or hoped, would yield dirt. He found, Morgan continued, her voice dripping with false concern, a very creative accounting of sales, shall we say, and some rather enthusiastic projections for growth that don't quite align with, well, reality. The words were designed to paint me as a fraud, a dreamer living in a fantasy world, propped up by deceit. But as she spoke, a strange thought occurred to me. If Mr. Davies was as thorough as she claimed, and as professional as his firm's reputation suggested, wouldn't he have also looked into the person commissioning the investigation? Especially if she seemed overly eager, almost desperate to find fault. Professionals, good ones anyway, often have a nose for ulterior motives. It was a fleeting thought, a tiny spark of defiance against the gloom she was so expertly weaving. Maybe, just maybe, her own desperation had been her undoing. Morgan took another theatrical sip of her martini, which had miraculously reappeared, freshly refilled, as if summoned by the sheer force of her impending drama. She adjusted the reading glasses she rarely wore, another prop for her performance of serious scrutiny, and began to read from Mr. Davies's report. Page 1, she announced, her voice laced with the smug certainty of a prosecutor about to land a killing blow. Subject, Ava Thompson. Business, Desert Bloom Pottery. Initial findings. She scanned the page, a small frown flickering across her lips before being quickly smoothed away. It was a minuscule shift, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Mr. Davies confirms. She read, her voice a fraction less confident now. That Desert Bloom Pottery is, in fact, a registered sole proprietorship in the state of North Carolina, established approximately 2 years ago. A beat of silence. Uncle Leo's eager expression faltered slightly. This wasn't the immediate bombshell they were expecting, was it? He notes, Morgan continued, flipping a page with a little more force than necessary. That the business maintains an active online presence, with a professionally designed e-commerce website, and generally positive customer reviews, across multiple platforms. My mother let out a small, almost inaudible sigh, which could have been relief, or perhaps just the sound of her holding her breath for too long. Morgan cleared her throat again. Furthermore, she pressed on, her voice regaining some of its earlier sharpness, as if determined to find the dirt she'd paid good money for. The financial overview, based on publicly available data and industry comparables, suggests modest but consistent revenue growth, indicative of a legitimately operating small enterprise. Modest but consistent. Legitimate. Those weren't the words Morgan had been hoping to weaponize. The air around our table, once thick with Morgan's impending triumph, now shimmered with a confused, almost awkward silence. Even Morgan seemed momentarily thrown, her eyes darting from the page to my face, as if searching for an explanation for the trick I'd somehow pulled. Of course, she recovered quickly, her smile a little tighter. This is just the preliminary overview, the surface level. She tapped another section of the report. Mr. Davies also looked into, shall we say, the less public aspects. Was this it? Was this where the fabricated failures, the exaggerated shortcomings, were about to be paraded? I braced myself, my gaze steady on hers, refusing to show the tremor of anxiety that still fluttered deep inside. But then I saw it again, that tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation in her eyes as she scanned the next paragraph, a flicker of something that wasn't triumph, but confusion, or was it dawning horror? The silence stretched, and for the first time all evening, Morgan looked less like a predator and more like someone who'd just realized the trap she'd set had a far more complex mechanism than she'd ever imagined. And the ticking of that beige bomb on the table suddenly sounded a lot more ominous, not for me, but for her. Morgan's perfectly sculpted smile was now a thin, brittle line. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sheen of sweat on her upper lip. She cleared her throat, a dry rasping sound this time. As I was saying, she stammered, her voice no longer smooth but cracking slightly. Mr. Davies is exceptionally thorough. Her hand, the one not holding the report, was trembling under the table. I just knew it. She flipped another page, and this time, the heading at the top was different. It didn't say Ava Thompson. It said, Subject Addendum, Morgan Thompson Green. My breath caught. Green was her married name, one she paraded like a trophy, though her husband, a perpetually bewildered-looking investment banker named Richard, was conspicuously absent tonight. Stuck on a very important conference call, or so Morgan had claimed. Appears, Morgan Reed, her voice now barely a whisper, each word dragged out as if from a great depth, that in the course of his investigation, certain discrepancies arose regarding the commissioning party. Commissioning party. That was her. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in Nana Helen's water glass. Mr. Davies notes, she continued, her gaze fixed on the page as if it were a venomous snake. An inquiry into the provided academic credentials for Morgan Thompson Green revealed that the master's degree from Prestige Thrift, from that prestigious East Coast business school she often mentioned, is listed as incomplete. No degree was conferred. A collective gasp, soft but audible, rippled around the table. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Dad looked like he'd been punched. Uncle Leo, for once, was utterly speechless, his jaw slack. This wasn't just a crack in Morgan's perfect facade. This was a sledgehammer blow. But Mr. Davies, bless his thorough, professional heart, wasn't done. Furthermore, Morgan's voice trembled as she forced herself to read on. A review of publicly accessible financial records, cross-referenced with certain lifestyle expenditures discussed during initial consultations. Her own consultations with Mr. Davies, no doubt, where she'd probably boasted about her success to justify her concern for me, indicate a significant level of unsecured personal debt. Multiple credit cards appear to be utilized, in a maxed-out and revolving pattern. The queen of financial prudence, the one who'd always lectured me about my irresponsible artist budget, was drowning in debt. The irony was so thick, so deliciously potent, I almost laughed. And then came the part that made even my hardened heart skip a beat. Additionally, Morgan choked out the words, during a routine verification of ATH, of certain charitable contributions, claimed by Mrs. Thompson Green for tax purposes, specifically relating to the Helen Thompson Family Foundation for Aspiring Artists, a foundation Nana Helen had set up years ago. One I knew Morgan barely acknowledged, let alone contributed to significantly. Mr. Davies discovered a series of irregular fund transfers. Small amounts, initially, then larger, from the foundation's account to a private, unlisted account under the name of M. Green Creative Consulting, an entity with no discernible business activity. Embezzlement, from Nana's foundation. My own sister. The room spun. The air crackled. This wasn't just lies about a degree or credit card debt. This was a betrayal of the worst kind, a theft from the very legacy she pretended to uphold. Morgan's face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that was no longer performative but terrifyingly real. The beige folder had done its work. The bomb had detonated. The silence that followed the final, damning revelation about the foundation was absolute. A vacuum that sucked all the air from the chestnut room. Morgan, still clutching the report, looked like a statue carved from ice. Her face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Then, Nana Helen made a small, choked sound, and the silver desert fork she'd been holding clattered onto her porcelain plate. The sharp metallic clang echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. That small sound seemed to break the spell. My mother, Martha gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if to physically keep her heart from leaping out. Her face, which had been pale, was now a ghastly shade of white. Morgan, can this be true? She whispered, her voice trembling, directed at her favored daughter. But her eyes darted towards me, wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. Dad, who had been a pillar of stoic disinterest for most of the evening, was now gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He stared at Morgan, not with anger, not yet, but with a profound, almost stunned disappointment that was somehow worse. The foundation. Helen's foundation. He finally managed, his voice hoarse. Uncle Leo, usually so quick with a snide remark or a piece of unsolicited advice, just kept shaking his head slowly, his mouth agape, like a fish out of water. The other guests, Those further down the table who might not have heard every damning word Morgan had been forced to read, were now leaning in. Their curiosity piqued by the sudden, dramatic shift in atmosphere, their whispers a low, insistent hum. Morgan finally moved. Her first instinct was to snatch the folder, to hide the evidence, her hands scrabbling at the pages. This is a mistake. A lie, she cried, her voice cracking, shrill. This investigator, Davies, he's incompetent. Or Ava paid him off. She set me up. The accusation was so wild, so desperate, it was almost pitiable. I didn't say a word, just met her frantic gaze with a calm I didn't entirely feel but projected with every ounce of will I possessed. The carefully constructed world of Morgan Thompson Green, built on a bedrock of perceived superiority and half-truths, was crumbling before our very eyes, and all it took was the quiet, methodical work of one thorough professional and her own blinding arrogance. No one rushed to her defense. No one offered a word of comfort. The silence from her usually sycophantic audience was, perhaps, the most damning verdict of all. She looked around the table, her eyes pleading, then landing on me with a renewed fury. But it was too late. The truth was out, hanging in the air, like the scent of smoke after a devastating fire. The accusations Morgan hurled that I'd somehow orchestrated this, paid off Mr. Davies, set her up, hung in the dead air, so outlandish they almost circled back to being comical. If the situation weren't so painfully raw, no one dignified them with a response. The weight of the truth, printed in stark black and white within that beige folder, was too heavy, too absolute. I simply looked at her, my sister, the architect of so much of my past pain, now a crumbling ruin of her own, there was no triumph in my gaze. No, I told you so. Just a profound, weary sadness, and perhaps, for the first time, a flicker of something akin to pity, though it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her earlier malice. She was still sputtering, her words a jumbled mess of denials and deflections, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline, anything. But every gaze she met was either averted in embarrassment or fixed on her with cold condemnation. The power dynamic in the chestnut room had irrevocably seismically shifted. It was no longer Morgan holding court, dispensing judgment. She was the one in the dock, judged and found wanting by the very people whose admiration she had so desperately cultivated. Morgan, I finally said, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through her frantic babbling. It was the first time I'd spoken directly to her since her presentation began. All eyes turned to me, expectant. You wanted truth, remember? I stated, not as a question, but as a simple, undeniable fact. It seems Mr. Davies delivered precisely that, perhaps more, than you bargained for. My words weren't an attack. They were an epitaph for her charade. The fight visibly drained out of her then. Her shoulders slumped. The frantic energy that had animated her accusations deflated like a pricked balloon. Her eyes, moments before, blazing with fury and panic, now welled with tears, hot, angry, humiliated tears. She let out a strangled sob, a sound so raw it was almost animalistic. Then, grabbing her ridiculously expensive handbag, she turned and fled. She didn't just walk out. She practically bolted, shoving past a bewildered waiter, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a shattered birthday party, a stunned family, and the undeniable ruinous truth of her own making. The beige folder still sat on the table, an innocuous object that had detonated a lifetime of lies. The slamming of the restaurant's main door as Morgan exited seemed to echo for an eternity in the suddenly vast, cold space of the chestnut room. No one spoke. The only sounds were the clinking of ice in half-empty glasses and the distant, muffled cheer from another party in a separate section of the restaurant. A jarring reminder of normalcy somewhere else in the world. My mother was openly weeping now, quiet, heartbroken sobs into a linen napkin, while Dad just stared blankly at the spot Morgan had vacated. His face a roadmap of conflicting emotions, anger, shame, disbelief. Uncle Leo looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, all the earlier bluster gone, replaced by a weary understanding. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence, to explain myself, or to manage anyone else's emotions. It was a strange, almost buoyant sensation, like a heavy weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted. The lemon raspberry cake, Nana Helen's favorite, sat mostly untouched. Its cheerful yellow, a cruel mockery now. Nana, herself was very still, her gaze distant. I couldn't read her expression, and for once, I didn't try. Was she devastated by Morgan's betrayal? Disappointed in her family? Or perhaps, a small, hopeful part of me wondered, was she feeling a sliver of the same strange relief I was? I'd never know, not really. What I did know was that my role in this family drama, the one they had cast me in for so long, the scapegoat, the sensitive one, the failure was over. I had not sought this confrontation, but now that it had happened, now that the truth, in all its ugly glory, was out, I felt strangely cleansed. I pushed my chair back slowly. All eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, turned to me again, but this time there was no expectation, no judgment, just a weary curiosity about what I would do next. I walked over to Nana Helen, leaned down, and kissed her soft, papery cheek. "Happy birthday, Nana," I whispered. "I love you." Her hand reached up and squeezed mine, a brief, firm pressure that conveyed more than words ever could. That was all. The goodbye I needed. I didn't look at my parents, didn't acknowledge Uncle Leo. I simply turned. Walked towards the exit with my head held high, my steps even and unhurried. The click of my heels on the polished floor was the only sound I made, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a very long, very painful chapter. The drive back to North Carolina was long, but for the first time in years, the silence in my car didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. It was the silence of a slate wiped, of a chapter definitively closed. I didn't replay the night's events, in an endless loop of what-ifs or should-haves. There was a strange sort of peace in knowing the worst had happened. The truth was out, and I had survived it, perhaps even emerged stronger. My phone remained off for the entire 12-hour drive, a deliberate act of self-preservation, when I finally turned it back on the next morning. Back in the sanctuary of my small Asheville apartment, the notifications flooded in. Missed calls. From my mother, Martha. Voicemails. A barrage of texts. The first few were frantic. "Ava, where are you? Are you okay? Call me immediately." Then they shifted. "We need to talk about what happened. This is a misunderstanding. Morgan is devastated." Misunderstanding? Devastated. The audacity was almost breathtaking. I scrolled through them, a detached observer of my mother's attempts to smooth things over, to manage the narrative, to perhaps, once again, cast me in the role of the one who needed to be more understanding, more forgiving. One text in particular stood out. "Ava, please. Your father and I just want to clear the air. This family is falling apart. Can't you just let it go for Nana's sake? Let it go." After years of their complicity, their willful blindness, to Morgan's manipulative cruelty, their subtle and not so subtle dismissals of my worth. For Nana's sake. Nana, who had squeezed my hand in a moment of silent, profound understanding. That was the moment the last thread of obligation, of misplaced familial duty, finally snapped. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I simply opened her contact, my thumb hovering over the block number option for a long moment. It wasn't an act of anger, not anymore. It was an act of profound, liberating self-care. With a quiet click, it was done. A digital severing, yes, but more than that, it was an emotional emancipation. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, full of peace, full of me. Sunlight, warm and unfiltered, now streams into my Asheville studio, illuminating the specks of clay dust dancing in the air like tiny, earth-toned fairies. It's a different kind of light than the sterile, judgmental glare I grew up under, in Ohio. This light feels like acceptance. My small apartment, attached to the studio, smells of fresh coffee, damp earth from the clay, and a hint of lavender from the diffuser Nana Helen sent me last Christmas, a silent, knowing gift, perhaps. It's been 6 months since that disastrous 80th birthday party, 6 months of profound, uninterrupted peace. My phone no longer feels like a potential landmine. My email inbox isn't a source of anxiety. Desert Bloom Pottery hasn't suddenly become a global empire, and that's perfectly okay. But orders are steady, each one a small affirmation from a stranger who connects with something I've made with my own hands, my own heart. Just this morning, an email popped up with the subject line, "Your beautiful work." It was from a woman in Oregon who'd purchased one of my custom glazed vases. She wrote, "It's even more stunning in person. It sits on my windowsill and catches the morning light perfectly. Thank you for creating something that brings a little bit of joy into my day." Tears pricked my eyes, not of sadness or anger, but of a quiet, profound gratitude. This was it. This was the success Morgan could never understand, could never touch. It wasn't about outdoing anyone, or proving a point to those who doubted me. It was about connection, about creating something real in a world that often felt overwhelmingly fake. I picked up a lump of cool, pliable clay. My hands, once hesitant and unsure under the weight of family expectations, now moved with a practiced confidence, shaping the earth into something new, something born of resilience. The silence of my studio wasn't empty. It was alive with the hum of the kiln, the gentle scratch of tools, the rhythm of my own breathing. This wasn't just a business. It was my sanctuary, my therapy, my quiet rebellion that had blossomed into a life. A life I didn't have to justify, explain, or apologize for to anyone. And as I centered the clay on the wheel, preparing to give it form, I felt a sense of wholeness I hadn't known was possible, a peace that was entirely, beautifully, mine. Looking back, that night at Nana Helen's party feels like a scene from someone else's incredibly dramatic movie. Yet, the lessons I carried away from it are profoundly, intimately, mine. The first, and perhaps the hardest, was about the nature of truth. For so long, I'd let their version of my story, Morgan's carefully crafted narrative of my failures, define me, at least in their eyes, and sometimes, in my own darkest moments, in mine too. But truth, real truth, has a funny way of surfacing, often when you least expect it, and not always in the way you'd planned. Mr. Davies's folder wasn't my weapon, but it became a mirror reflecting the ugliness Morgan tried so hard to project onto me. It taught me that you don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes, you just have to let the truth do its own heavy lifting. Another lesson was about boundaries, those invisible lines that are so crucial for survival, especially around toxic people. For years, I'd allowed mine to be trampled, redrawn, and erased, all in the name of family or keeping the peace. That night, and in the days that followed, particularly when I blocked my mother's number, I finally understood. True peace doesn't come from placating others. It comes from protecting your own. And perhaps the most liberating lesson of all was redefining success. The world, and certainly my family, had a very narrow, materialistic definition. The corporate job, the right zip code, the designer labels. For a long time, a part of me chased that, or at least felt inadequate for not achieving it their way. But the quiet joy of a customer's email, the satisfaction of shaping something beautiful from a lump of earth, the profound peace of my sunlit studio, that was a success Morgan's pie report could never measure, and one her kind of ambition could never buy. It's a quiet strength, a resilience built not on external validation but on internal alignment. Do I miss the idea of a loving, supportive family? Of course, there's a small, tender part of me that will always grieve for the relationships that should have been, that could have been. But I've learned that sometimes, the healthiest love is the one you give yourself, especially when others are incapable or unwilling. And I've learned that sometimes, your silence after the storm, your refusal to engage in their chaos, is the most powerful answer you can give. It's the sound of you choosing you. So, that's my story, or at least, one very memorable chapter of it. A chapter that started with a dreaded family summons and ended with an unexpected, liberating truth. It wasn't easy, and the scars, though faded, are still a part of who I am, but they no longer define me. They remind me of the strength I didn't know I had. The path to healing, to finding your own definition of peace and success, is rarely a straight line. It's often messy, filled with moments of doubt, anger, and profound sadness. But through it all, learning to trust your own voice, your own truth, is paramount. That beige folder, intended as a weapon against me, inadvertently became my liberation papers. Because sometimes, the universe, or maybe just a very thorough private investigator, has a funny way of delivering exactly what you need, even if it's wrapped in the packaging of your worst nightmare. I often wonder what happened to Morgan after that night, or to the rest of my family. I hear whispers sometimes, through the grapevine, filtered and vague, but honestly, I don't seek them out. Their story is no longer my story. My focus now is on the sunlight in my studio, the feel of clay in my hands, and the quiet joy of a life built on authenticity. And I share this with you today, not for sympathy, but for connection, because I know I'm not the one who's faced a family gathering that felt more like a battlefield. So, I'm curious, if you were in my shoes that night, how do you think you would have reacted? Have you ever had to confront a truth about a loved one that changed everything? Share your stories, your thoughts, your own moments of reckoning in the comments below. Let's create a space where we can all feel a little less alone in our journeys. And of course, if these kinds of real-life stories resonate with you, If you're interested in exploring the messy, beautiful, and ultimately empowering journey of finding your truth, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. Thank you for listening, truly. And remember, your peace is worth fighting for. That was quite the journey, wasn't it? The path to peace isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. What are your thoughts on Ava's story, or Morgan's shocking downfall? Have you ever faced a similar situation where family drama took center stage? I'd love to hear your experiences and insights in the comments below. Let's support each other. And if you appreciate stories about resilience, uncovering the truth, and finding your own strength, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter together. Thanks for being here.